So I've been thinking about making a post, like writing one, but every time I've tried to, I can't seem to find the right words. So I thought maybe it would be easier and to do a video post. So I'm just going to start from the beginning. About 5 years before I got pregnant with Jackson, I started having issues with my cycle, and over that next 5 years and 3 different states and 7 different doctors, I was told I couldn't have kids and that fertility would always be an issue, and that even with fertility treatments I probably wouldn't get pregnant. And 5 years, 7 different doctors in 3 different states, Georgia, Texas, Colorado, and it was devastating. And I thought for those 5 years that I would never have children and I would never have a family. And then Jackson happened, and I was extremely caught off guard, and I had some minor complications with that pregnancy, but obviously everything came out fine. Jackson was born 39 weeks, it was great. And after he was born, I think it was probably 8 or 9 months after he was born, I started getting my cycles again, and they were regular for about 2 years. And then they weren't. And they started very slowly to be irregular, and then it got worse and worse and worse, and it would bleed for weeks at a time, or I'd go for over a month without one. And I have just, for as long as I can remember, struggled with irregular cycles, as far as the time of cycles, the length of cycles, and the length of bleeding, also symptoms of all of that. So PMS symptoms and all of that craziness, fun stuff. So after I started becoming irregular again, I started going back to my OB, trying to figure out what's going on, how can I fix this. I did not want to be on birth control anymore. I had been on it for 5 years before it just stopped working one day, literally just stopped working. And after that point is when I started having the issues. And so I didn't want to be on birth control anymore. And so we just tried to find an actual reason for my irregularity. And during that process of trying to figure it all out, my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer. And she had a lumpectomy. And after that, they tested her for any genetic mutations, because she had had breast cancer. Her mother had had breast cancer and uterine cancer, and she had an aunt who had some other cancer. And so because there were enough people, she qualified to have this genetic test. And so she tested, and she tested positive for the BRCA2 gene mutation. And so because of that, because of her positive result, I was able to get tested. When one of your parents, either mom or dad, test positive for that gene mutation, you have a 50% chance of having that gene mutation as well. And so I got tested for it. And again, during this time, I was already being tested for all of these other things that had to do with my fertility and my cycles and all this other stuff. And I was prepared for bad news. You know, my mom had breast cancer, my grandma had breast cancer and uterine cancer 10 years after that, and I was just convinced that I was going to have this gene mutation, that it was going to be positive. That was just my luck. And I had already talked to my OB about what that would mean for me. I like to be prepared. I'm a planner, And he told me that if I were to test positive for the gene mutation, that he would want to take my fallopian tubes now. I'm 34 now, I was 33 at the time. So at 33 years old, he would take my fallopian tubes. At 40, he would take my ovaries. And soon after, he would do a full hysterectomy and a bilateral mastectomy if I had this gene mutation. And I, again, was convinced that I had it. And I had been talking to him about possibly trying to get pregnant in the near future with Jesse. And he said that if I were to test positive, then we would pretty much have to start trying then. Like, I would need to be, okay, right now, we have to try now to get pregnant, because as soon as possible, I need to basically strip myself of all of these baby making materials in my body. And I got tested. It was just a blood draw, but it took weeks for the results. And it took like 3 to 4 weeks. And in that time, I was convinced that it was going to be positive. And so Jesse and I were kind of preparing ourselves for kind of being like forced and pushed into having to try to get pregnant, whether we were ready or not. Because if we ever wanted kids, and like now was our chance, it was kind of like a now or never kind of thing. 3 to 4 weeks later, I got a call from the doctor, and my results were in, and they were negative. So we didn't have to rush. We didn't have to rush into trying to get pregnant. We were still living in Washington at the time, and not living together. I had my own place. He had his own place. I was living with Allie and Xander. And once we got that call that we didn't have to start trying, we had already been preparing ourselves for a month. And we felt, both of us, like, you know what, let's just not even wait. Let's just start trying. We just kind of felt ready at that point. And so we started to try. Well, I went back to my OB, because before I had the gene mutation test, I can't remember the name for it, but he actually finally found a reason for my irregular cycles, and it had to do with like ovaries producing like progesterone and estrogen, and one of the hormones makes the tissue like build in the uterus, and the other one makes it shed. And I had an overproduction of one and an underproduction of the other, and basically I have an imbalance, a hormone imbalance. I have an irregular production of hormones, which could get in the way of fertility, just because it makes it more difficult to track, and it's hard to tell if I ovulate and when. And it was nice to finally have an answer after 5+ years. Also to know that it wasn't as big of a deal as other doctors had made it seem. But anyways, after the negative test, I told him, you know what, we're ready. And he prescribed me Clomid, which is a pill that helps you ovulate. It does something to your like brain cells that tricks you into thinking like you're not producing enough estrogen, so that your body produces more, which makes you ovulate more. Anyways, you're only supposed to be on that med for like 6 months, usually, like top. And I guess because it's not good, like side effects of it, or like long-term use is not good for your body. And then usually after that, you go on to next steps for fertility. And so I started the Clomid when we were still in Washington. I got the prescription, and then we moved. So I moved in December. Jesse moved like 2 weeks later in January. and I was able to fill my prescription from Fred Meyer to Kroger here, but I didn't have a doctor anymore to follow up with. But I was like, it's pretty self-explanatory. Like, you take the pills for starting on a certain day of your cycle, and that's it. And so for 8 months, there was 1 month where I skipped the pills because my uncle got sick, and I went home to be with my aunt, and I forgot to take my pills with me, and so I missed that month. So over the course of 8 months, I took, for 7 of those months, I took the treatment, the medication that was supposed to help me ovulate. And it didn't work, I guess. Obviously, some of the times it didn't even help me ovulate, because for those months of trying, I tested every day, multiple times a day, checking my LH levels and trying to look for that surge to say that I was ovulating and whatever. If you've ever tried to get pregnant on purpose, then you know what I'm talking about. But it was hard every single month, and each month that passed that I didn't get pregnant was harder and harder and harder. And the hardest part of all was that I didn't share this with a lot of people. I did share with a couple of my closest girlfriends, and I told my aunt. And at the time, my mom was going through surgery and, you know, all of this cancer stuff and chemo, and I didn't feel like it was a burden that I wanted to put on her, which now looking back is so silly, because she's my mom, and of course she would do anything for her child. And but whatever, I didn't tell her at the time because I didn't want any extra worry and stress on her shoulders while she was battling all of that. So I didn't tell her. And I didn't even really talk to my aunt. I told her about it in the beginning, but then I never really talked to her about it. And even those girlfriends that I told, I kind of was like, hey, we're trying, and then didn't really like follow up with how I was feeling or the actual journey of it all. So it was a pretty lonely road. And 8 months later, I ran out of my refills for the prescription. And I knew that whatever the next step was after Clomid, like if Clomid didn't work, it wasn't going to be easy. And I think now that I've kind of looked a little into it, and usually once you've tried Clomid and then it doesn't work after 6 months, the next steps are usually like IUI or IVF, and you kind of go on from there. But like, it's like fertility treatments, like you have to go to a like actual like fertility doctor. And anyways, so the month that I ended my pills, my Clomid pills, it was right before our trip to Italy, and so I didn't want to have to mess with trying to find a doctor and all that stuff, like during that month of, you know, we were about to travel and leave the country, and we had a lot going on. And so I was like, you know what, let's just do our trip, and once we come home, then we'll worry about it. So once we come home, then I'll find a doctor, and we'll figure out the next steps in our fertility journey. And so our trip to Italy was my first cycle off of Clomid, off of the pills, not tracking. I started to in the very like first 2 days. I tried to like keep doing the ovulation strips, but we were on vacation and we had a lot going on, and it was so hot, and we were like tired all the time, and we were showering twice a day, and it was just too much to like keep up with. And so I didn't. And so it was the first month in 8 months that we weren't tracking anything, we weren't timing anything, we weren't taking medication, and you know, we were on vacation. And then we came home, and like a week or two after we had been home, one morning I woke up and I went to the bathroom, and I have a cup. I wish I had grabbed it, but it's over there and I don't want to get up. But it's a cup. It's a cup like this big, and it says baby dust on it, which, if you don't know what that means, it's kind of like a saying in the fertility journey community of like wishing good luck for you to get pregnant, like sprinkle baby dust, like baby dust to you, like good luck that you get pregnant kind of thing. Anyways, I have this cup that says baby dust, and it's the cup that I would pee in and dip all my little strips in. And at this point, it had been 9 months of trying, which was 9 months of daily testing with ovulation strips, and then going through the motion of looking for a surge, and then after a week or two after that, doing the pregnancy tests and getting negative after negative after negative. It just became a routine. And so that particular morning was August 5th. And I woke up because my son Jackson had walked into the room and woke me up, and he needed, I don't know, food or TV remote or something. And I went to the bathroom and I grabbed the cup. I peed in it. I dipped my little strips in it, and I dipped the ovulation strip and a pregnancy strip in there out of habit, like pure habit. Did not even think about it. In fact, I so much didn't think about it that I did not even wait for the results. Like usually I time it for the like 3 minutes you're supposed to wait, and then I'll look at it, and I didn't. I was so tired. I dipped the strips in, I set them by the sink, and after I was done, I went back to bed. I didn't even wait to look at them, and I went back to sleep. I didn't wake up again until Jesse got up for work, and he went to work, and after he left, I got up to go to the bathroom, because at this point I had slept for another like 5 hours. So I went to the bathroom, and as I'm sitting on the toilet, I'm like, oh yeah, I took these tests earlier, and I picked them up, and I looked at them, and there was the faintest line on the pregnancy test. I'm like, there's no way. Also, it's been like 7 hours since I took this test, so I need to take another test. But I was already sitting on the toilet. I just peed. So I'm frantic. I'm like freaking out, like trying to control my breathing. And I grabbed the cup, my little baby dust cup, and I collect as much pee as I could that was left in me, which was luckily just enough. Because it's just a strip. It's just like one of those little thin strips that you dip in there. And I dipped the strip, and I also had one of those 88-cent. They're 88 cents, the little pregnancy test, and they have a little dropper, and you just need literally 3 drops of pee. And I did one of those as well. And I waited 3 minutes, which was the longest 3 minutes I felt like. And I remember turning my phone on, turning the video on, and I'm like, I really want to catch my like reaction, and I recorded it, and which I will probably share later, my reaction. But when I looked at the tests, they were positive, and I was shocked and excited and just kind of like speechless, because we'd been trying for so long, and here was my positive pregnancy test, and I was pregnant. And we got pregnant in Italy, and when we're on vacation after 8 months of being on medication and then not being on medication anymore, and it was just so surreal. And Jesse had already left for work, and I had to work that night, and I ended up having to wait 13 hours before I saw him and could tell him the news. In the meantime, I tried to call like my girlfriends and And I didn't tell my mom right away because I had this whole idea of how I wanted to like break the news to her. And so I told a couple of girlfriends, and then I kind of felt guilty that I didn't tell Jessie yet. And but I made this cute little box. I had this box that when you opened it, it had like little onesies in it, and little mittens, and a card that said like I can't remember, something about being a daddy, and all of my pregnancy tests that I had taken, because I ended up, when I went to the store to get all of these things for this box, I bought more pregnancy tests, and I got a digital one that said, yes, you're pregnant. And when I got home from work that night, well, it was the next day at 5 a.m., I gave it to Jesse, which I also recorded. And he thought I was kidding at the time, which is so funny, because why would I ever joke about that? Like, I would never be like, oh, hey, I'm pregnant, psych. But whatever. That weekend, I had already been planning on going to Brackett to visit my tia Soyla. She was having a really hard time. Her husband, my Uncle David, had been diagnosed previously with cancer, and he was going through his treatment, and it was really starting to take a toll on him, and which in effect was taking a toll on her. And they just weren't doing very well. And so I had planned this trip to visit and, you know, spend some time with them. And then I found out I was pregnant. And so I wanted to tell her, and I wanted to tell the rest of my family in Brackett. And I'm like, well, I can't tell my family in Brackett without telling my mom first. So then I planned on driving through Brownwood and then to Brackett. So then I had this whole idea of how I'm going to tell my mom, and it's not going to be like last time, because when I was pregnant with Jackson, I called my mom at like midnight. I think it was midnight my time and like 2 a.m. her time or something crazy. It was literally the middle of the night, and I was hysterically crying. And she's like, oh my God, what's wrong? And I'm like, I think I'm pregnant. And she's like, why are you crying? And it was, it was very crazy, emotional, and not at all like I had expected or planned on telling my mom for the first time that she was going to be a grandma. So this time I wanted it to be not as crazy as the last time. And so we drove through Brownwood, and I had gotten her a gift from Italy, and I gave it to her, and I was kind of like, hey, we also brought this other thing from Italy, like, here you go. And it was a positive pregnancy test, and it's really cute. And again, I'll probably share that video later, maybe, depending on how I feel. And then after, you know, we had our whole like little tears and hugs and celebratory everything, I went to Brackett, and I ended up telling my aunt and my uncle David, and then the rest of my family. And I had planned on telling my dad, like, we were supposed to drive back through San Antonio, and I was going to tell my dad. But then one of my cousins had COVID, and because David was going through treatment, we had to leave like earlier than we were planning on, and I couldn't see the rest of my family because my other uncle, my Tio Jesus, was also sick, and we just had to leave before we could see everybody else in person. I didn't even get to see my dad. I didn't get to see my uncles, and we left because we thought maybe we might be contagious. Like, we didn't know if we had it, and we didn't want to pass it on to anybody, especially my uncle who was going through chemo, and my other uncle who was going through dialysis and all that stuff. And my dad also has health problems, and I was pregnant, and so we just went home, but without like getting to see anybody else. I had to tell my dad over FaceTime, because that was that. Everybody knew. And I don't have insurance, neither does Jesse. We are working part-time at the casino right now, and so in order to see a doctor, I had to switch my VA benefits. I I have healthcare benefits through the VA, but it's like you have to set it up in the state that you like live in and in the city and all that stuff. And so I had it originally in Colorado when I first got pregnant with Jackson, and then when I moved to Washington I was able to transfer it, but I hadn't transferred it here yet to Texas. And so that was a really long process, and like looking back has been a nightmare. Like, those who say the VA healthcare system is a joke is not lying. It's been, anyways, it took probably a whole month before I finally was seen for my first appointment. I kept calling and trying to schedule it, and I kept telling them, like, I'm really concerned. My first pregnancy, so my pregnancy with Jackson was high risk. He had a 2-vessel cord, and I had a large placental leg. I had gestational diabetes, and it was like all these other like little things that had like popped up, but it was deemed a high risk pregnancy. And I had to see a specialist, a maternal fetal medicine specialist, and I had to have like monthly ultrasounds to make sure that he was getting enough nutrients and growing properly and like blah blah blah. And because my cycles were so irregular, my first ultrasound with Jackson was actually at 5 weeks and 3 days. And I will never forget that day. You know, I saw him, he was literally like a little jelly bean. Like, he just looked like a little jelly bean. And 5 weeks, 3 days, that was the first time I got to see my son. And I was like 6 weeks pregnant, and I'm trying to call the VA and trying to get this set up, and like, oh, well, you have to see your primary here and get the initial visit before we can refer you to an OB, blah blah blah. And so I had to wait for them to call me, and during the time that I was waiting for them to call me, and I had already called them multiple times in like 2 weeks trying to say, I need to see a doctor as soon as possible. My first pregnancy was high risk. I'm just really concerned. I need to see somebody now, right? At that time, I was already like 6 weeks pregnant, 7 weeks. And so I'm waiting for them to call me back. And during that time, I was at work, and I was on break, and my uncle called. He was trying to get a hold of my mom. My mom had been visiting that weekend. She was babysitting my son, and it was 4 o'clock in the morning. I remember when I saw his name on my phone as it was ringing. I'm like, this is not good. Like, why is he calling me at 4 in the morning? And I answered, and he asked me where my mom was. He said that he was trying to get a hold of her. He couldn't, she wasn't answering her phone. And I'm like, okay, I can call Jesse. He should be home soon, or by now, or whatever. What's going on? Like, what's happening? And he told me that my tia Suela had just called him, and that my Uncle David had just passed away. And I had just seen him. We had just seen him like a week and a half before that, when we had to leave early because of the whole like COVID exposure. But us at work, it was, anyways, I left. I went home. I saw my mom. She left the next day. She went to Brackett to be with my aunt, and Jackson was in school. He just started pre-K this year, and I didn't want to pull him out of school, and so I was gonna wait until they came up with a where they had planned a funeral date. And I got a call from the VA finally, and the soonest they could see me was that Thursday, and if I didn't take that Thursday appointment, they wouldn't be able to see me for another 3 weeks. And I was like, I can't do that. I'll already be like 11 weeks at that point. I can't wait that long. And so the funeral, unfortunately, got scheduled on the same day as my doctor's appointment, and so I had to miss it. I had to miss my uncle's funeral so that I could go to my VA appointment. And this was not even a baby appointment. This was just my initial visit. They had to like prove the pregnancy before they could submit the OB referral. And so they did a blood workup and whatever. Then the next week, I can't even remember if it was 1 or 2 weeks after that, I started cramping. It was very light and mild, and it's usually pretty normal in the first trimester, so I didn't really think a whole lot about it. It was a Thursday when I started cramping, and then Friday, the very next day, the cramps were worse. And I was pretty concerned about it. But again, I really like wasn't bleeding, and I wasn't in it. I wouldn't call it painful. They were uncomfortable, right? So if you had to do the whole like 1 to 10 scale, they were probably like a 3 or 4. So I went to work. I went to work that Friday night, and I think it was only after my first push. I had only been at work for like not even 2 hours, and on my first break, I went to the bathroom and I was spotting. Just spotting. It wasn't a lot. It was like a light pink. It was enough though to scare me, because I'd already been I'd been cramping pretty much. Like, I'd been cramping that day and the day before. So I left work and I called Jesse and I told him I was on my way to the ER. He was able to leave work and meet me. He met me at the ER. He got there like a couple minutes after I did. And we went in. I told him what was going on. I had been cramping. I was bleeding or spotting a little bit. I was just scared. I hadn't had my first appointment yet. At that point, I was supposed to be 8 weeks. 8 weeks, and I hadn't had an initial appointment yet. And so we got checked in, and we thought at least we'll finally get to see our baby, because we hadn't had our initial appointment, so we hadn't had an ultrasound yet, and I knew that they would do one at the ER. Unfortunately, Jesse was not allowed to go back with me, and not only was he not allowed to go back with me, the tech was not allowed to show me what they were looking at either. So I didn't get to see the ultrasound either. So we did the ultrasound, they drew blood, and they blah, blah, blah. We waited there for hours, and the doctor finally came in. And I remember sitting there holding Jesse's hand, trying to be strong. Literally trying to think about all the times that everybody has told me what a strong person I am. And I'm trying to be strong. And I'm trying to be positive, and I'm trying to tell Jesse, like, this happens so much, like cramping and like light spotting, and women freak out about it, and it's nothing, because that actually happened with Jackson. I was by myself. I wasn't cramping, but I did have some spotting, and I went to the emergency room because my advice nurse told me to, and I was so freaked out and paranoid. And then they did the ultrasound, and there he was, a little gummy bear, and like moving around, and everything was fine. Obviously, Jackson is here. I have a baby, and he's 5, and I was sitting there. I'm holding Jesse's hand, and I'm telling him, it's gonna be fine. It's gonna be fine. And years from now, we're gonna look back on this day and. But then the doctor came in. The doctor came in, and he said that my HCG levels, I think they were like 3,900 or something like that, which is a little lower than they should be at 8 weeks. But he said for the level that they were, that there wasn't enough fetus activity. There was none, actually. There was no activity in the fetus, and there was no heartbeat. So he said it was possibly a miscarriage. And because I wasn't actively bleeding, there was really nothing else that they could do. He said that I needed to follow up with an OB to redo the scans and the tests to confirm. We were obviously devastated. So we left. By this point, I still had not had a call from the VA for my OB referral. So he's telling me I have to follow up with an OB that I didn't even have yet. And I still never even got to see the baby. We had still not seen anything. So we went home, brokenhearted. And that was a Friday. The next day, my other uncle was sent home on hospice. And it had only been a week since I had lost my first uncle. This was a lot going on emotionally, stress. So, also, it was the weekend before Jackson's 5th birthday. So I had made plans to go to Waco with my mom and my aunt and my uncle, and we were gonna have our own little kind of mini party for him. And I went there. And I knew I was gonna have to say something. And that was really hard to say out loud. But I did. And my mom and my aunt and my family, they were so good to me, as they always have been. But I did my best to celebrate my baby boy and his 5th birthday, and he had a great time at the arcade. And my uncle passed away that night. So I go home and I wait for my cousin and to tell me funeral plans and all that, so I can figure out what days I need to take off again for another funeral. And the funeral was Friday, I think. I can't even remember the day, but Thursday was the day I was leaving here, Sherman. So I leave Thursday and I drive for a few hours, and I get to Waco. I'm like right at Waco, and my phone rings, and I finally got the OB referral. And because they had already gotten the labs and all of the records from the ER, they were like, well, this is clearly urgent. We just had a cancellation for tomorrow morning. We can fit you in then. And then I said, well, I'm on my way out of town for a funeral. This was September 8th, the 9th, something like that, 7th, whatever that Thursday was. And they said, okay, well, let me see when the next available is. And the next available appointment they had wasn't for another 3 weeks, which was at the end of September.
I'm like, yeah, I can't wait that long. Because that 1 week already that we'd been waiting had been torture. Because they wouldn't call it a miscarriage. They were like, we have to wait and see if there's any progression. And it gave us like false hope. Like, maybe this is a mistake. Maybe they didn't look at it right. Maybe they're just wrong. So I had to miss another funeral. And that also meant that I had to tell my family. Because by this point, I had only told my mom and my aunt and my uncle, which is all on my mom's side. I hadn't told anybody from my dad's side yet, and I didn't want to, just because, like my dad had just lost his brother, and I didn't want to give him more bad news, and I just wasn't ready to talk about it, and I didn't want to have to say it out loud, but it was time, because I had to miss the funeral, and they had to know why I wasn't there. So I called my cousin, I called my dad, I tried to tell him, I called his girlfriend, like, hey, I need help telling my dad, and okay, went home. The next morning, Friday morning, I go to the OB with Jesse, and we're finally gonna see an ultrasound, and I don't know what I was expecting to see. But seeing nothing was more painful than I thought it would be. So the tech is talking us through what she's seeing, and there was a gestational sac, but there was no yolk sac, there was no fetal pole, and there was obviously no heartbeat. There was no baby inside. The gestational sac measured at 6 weeks, and at that point I should have been 9 weeks. So the baby just stopped growing. At 6 weeks, it just stopped developing. And I apparently was experiencing what they call a miscarriage or a silent miscarriage, which means the baby is dead, but your body doesn't recognize it and therefore doesn't expel it. Instead, it thinks that you're still pregnant. So the gestational sac continues to grow and your HCG levels continue to rise. And all the pregnancy symptoms are still there. So I was still getting cravings, and I was still hormonal, and I still felt pregnant, even though there was no baby. However, we are in the state of Texas, and that means they couldn't call it what it was, which is probably why they didn't even do it from the emergency room. In fact, I know that's why they didn't do it, because I've talked to other girls and some of my friends who have experienced this, and I've had some in other states who, from the very first ultrasound that showed no progression, they called it a miscarriage and they treated it from then. And here wasn't the case. Here, they told me they had to be 100% sure that the pregnancy was not viable before they moved on to other steps. This was 1 week later. This was 7 days after the first ultrasound. There was no progression. The gestational sac had barely grown. My HCG levels had barely risen. Like, barely. They went from like 3,300 to 4,900, which should have been 8,800 or something. Your HCG levels are supposed to double every 3 days, and obviously any doctor would know that. But the problem is when you have a miscarriage, again, what it means is your baby is no longer alive, and your body has not recognized that, and it hasn't expelled it naturally on its own. And when that happens, sometimes it needs help. And so that can be in the way of taking a pill or having a D&C, which is a surgery. However, that is also the same steps you take for an abortion. Because if you're early enough along in your pregnancy and you want an abortion, you take a pill. And if you're a little bit further than that, you have the D&C. You have a surgery to have it removed. And so here in the beautiful state of Texas, they had to be 100% sure that the pregnancy was not viable. Otherwise, they're not treating a miscarriage. They are treating an abortion request. So even though 7 days later, everything was pointing to a miscarriage, I still had to wait for a repeat scan because my OB said that they needed 2 weeks of scans and tests that showed no progression before they could call it a miscarriage. So we scheduled our next appointment, and I think they didn't have anything available on a Friday, which would have been a week later, so they scheduled me for Wednesday. And on Wednesday we went back and they did the repeat scans, and of course there was no progression. There was still no yolk sac, there was still no fetal pole, there was still no heartbeat. So they finally said for 100% sure, this is not a viable pregnancy. We went back and forth about our options, pills versus surgery, and it was not an easy decision because at this point I'd already joined a lot of support groups on Facebook, and probably like 90% of women who had experienced 1 versus 2, regardless of what they had experienced, like 90% of them said that they wish they had just done the D&C from the beginning. It was too hard emotionally, physically. Because so what happens is when you take the pills, it causes your body to expel the pregnancy. So it causes the contractions and it causes all of that, and then you bleed and everything exits your body, and it can be traumatic to see everything that comes out. And I was very scared of that. Because I already wasn't doing well emotionally and mentally. I had a lot going on personally with my family. I had just lost 2 uncles in the span of 2 weeks. And at the same time, I'm dealing with this, and I hadn't been sharing it with a whole lot of people, and we had tried for so long. We had been trying for 9 months to get pregnant, and I thought that was the hard part. I thought getting pregnant would be the hard part. I didn't even think. Nobody does, though, right? Nobody ever thinks that this could happen to me. Nobody thinks that. So of course I didn't. Of course I didn't even consider. Anyways, so the time was here. They called it non-viable pregnancy. I could wait for my body to handle it naturally. I could take the pills, or I could have a surgery. We decided to take the pills. I never really thought about the physical pain that it could cause. I only ever really thought about the emotional pain, right? Like, I don't think I can handle this emotionally, seeing this pregnancy come out. But oh my God, it was so painful. It was so painful. My body shook and trembled with pain. At one point, I was sitting on the toilet, and Jesse was sitting on the tub holding my hand. It was really, really, really hard. First night. And it didn't end there. That was Wednesday night. Thursday was a little better, but still painful. And today's Friday. Most of today has been okay. But probably just a couple hours ago, like as we get to the night, my cramps started getting a little bit hard again. And now I just feel empty. And did you know that 1 in 4 pregnancies, 1 in 4, end in miscarriage? That's crazy, because I know so many people with babies. So many. And I can count on maybe one hand how many I know who have been open about miscarrying. And I just want to take a moment to thank Holly and Kehlani for talking to me through it all. Y'all are probably the closest people to me that I knew. And I think that the only reason I knew is because we were close. Because I do know that there are many other women who I know, who I went to school with, who are on my Facebook, who are watching this right now, who have had miscarriages, that have probably experienced this. And I just didn't actually know, or, you know, we're not close. So it's not something you share with everybody. That makes it really hard, because it's already a difficult thing to experience and to go through, but it's so lonely. Even with my friends, even with the support groups, and even with my partner, and, you know, even with Jesse, like, Nobody knows. You can't possibly know what I'm going through. Because you aren't me. You aren't me. Maybe you're not even a woman. Even if you are a woman, you're not me. You haven't had my past. You don't know my family. You haven't suffered my losses. It's just, even talking to other people who've had pregnancy losses, their journeys were so different from mine. It wasn't as comforting as I thought it could be. So, the whole point of this video, I guess, is just to say after 9 months of trying, we finally got pregnant. And I remember thinking, God, how magical that story was. We'd been trying for so long, and we had been trying with meds until the moment that we ran out. And once we ran out of meds, and once we stopped tracking and counting days and timing things, we took a trip to Italy. And I don't know if you've ever been to Italy, but it is beautiful and magical, and we saw so many churches and basilicas, and every single one that we visited, I prayed so hard to get pregnant. And returning home from that trip and finding out that I was pregnant, it's such a good feeling when you feel like, and you just know that God has answered your prayers. And it's so hard. When it's taken away, and it's confusing, maddening. I was pregnant and now I'm not. And I don't know why. I probably never will. I'm sure there's a path for us. Everything happens for a reason. Weaker people at this point would turn away from God and maybe blame him or question his existence because of this pain. I'm not gonna lie, those thoughts tend to creep into my mind sometimes, but at the end of the day, I know he has a plan for me. And it will happen when it happens. But for anybody else who goes through anything like this, you're not alone. And you don't have to be alone. You don't have to suffer in silence. Just reach out to someone you know. To me, I don't care if we're not even close. It doesn't matter, because this will bond us. Join a support group. Do something. Because I promise you, it helps to talk to somebody else. And I can't wait until the day that Jesse and I get to share the most glorious news. Unfortunately, today is not that day. But it'll come. It'll come. That's what faith is, right?